Hi, my name is Tony Hanley, and I'm going to be talking, and today's date is January 14th, 2020. I'm going to be talking about the feedback loops in non-gravid females' reproductive system. And the easiest way to do this is to walk you through the menstrual cycle, because a lot of the hormones are produced by certain aspects of the menstrual cycle, and they're really what create the feedback loops. So it's easier just to walk you through the entire cycle so you can see where the hormones are produced when and what is having a positive or a negative feedback throughout the cycle. The ovaries, so they're part of the reproductive system and they're what produce the gametes. And they also produce a lot of the hormones that are responsible for the feedback loops and responsible for the menstrual cycle. So at birth, the ovaries contain 2 to 4 million follicles, but they aren't stimulated and they remain dormant until puberty. Menstruation then starts at puberty, which starts with the onset of the ovarian cycle. And at the beginning of the cycle, when follicles are recruited, it's not just one primary follicle that's recruited. It's recruitment of a few primordial follicles, but only one of those primordial follicles is actually going to be the one that produces the hormones and goes through the entire cycle. The rest of the follicles that have been recruited atrophy and die. The ovary is not the only place that hormones happen that are needed for the female menstrual cycle. The hypothalamus and the pituitary, specifically the anterior pituitary, also provide hormones that are needed for the feedback loops and for the cycle. So you start with the hypothalamus, which has the gonadotropin releasing hormone. So it is interesting to note, although it's not really part of a feedback loop, that the gonadotropin is released from a pulse generator every 1 to 3 hours in the hypothalamus. And the theory behind this is that is what's really responsible for sexual maturation and development of the human throughout our growth cycle. And gonadotropin releasing hormone stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone is released from the anterior pituitary. It's released under the guise of increased gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it's also released when there's low levels of estrogen. And it's what stimulates the maturation of the follicle. And the name kind of gives it away. So follicle stimulating, if you're ever confused, always think the follicular phase, follicle stimulating is the primary hormone. And it does stimulate the release of estrogen from the granulosa cells of the follicle. Then you have luteinizing hormone, and although luteinizing hormone or LH does play a part in the release of estrogen, that's not its main role in the feedback loops or in the menstrual cycle. It's the main hormone responsible for the start of ovulation and the development of the corpus luteum. And as I mentioned, it does stimulate the release of estrogen from the follicle, but that's not its primary role. So there are several hormones that are produced by the ovarian follicle itself. So it's interesting to note, and I included the carbon compounds here, that the steroid hormones all have a common basis of cholesterol. And that, depending on what enzymes act on them, depends on what you get in terms of cholesterol, aldosterone, androgens, testosterone, estrogen, or proestrogene. Certain enzymes, if they're close enough in form, are able to convert, say, testosterone to estrogen, and it's because they have such a similar base and a similar carbon form. With the variation in carbons, usually the distinction between the two or between the hormones. So estrogen is a carbon 18 hormone, and it has 3 forms. It has estradiol, which is E1, which is a weak estrogen, and not really the primary estrogen that we talk about when we talk about feedback loops. You have estradiol, which is the main form of estrogen, and what I'm going to be talking about when I talk about the feedback loops and what impacts LH and gonadotropin releasing hormone and FSH. And then estradiol is the estrogen of pregnancy, and it's produced by the placenta. Since we're talking about non-gravid females and what happens if fertilization does not occur, we're not going to be talking about estradiol. It's just interesting to note that there are multiple forms of estrogen. So estrogen promotes the development of breasts, the uterine, the vaginal muscles. It also affects skin, smooth muscles, bones, and the CNS. So it does have multiple roles throughout the body. Progesterone is a carbon-21 compound, and it induces the secretory activity of the endometrial glands, and they've been primed by estrogen to be worked on by progesterone. And progesterone thickens the cervical mucus, reduces uterine contractions, and has a thermogenic effect that raises basal body temperature after ovulation. And women often track this so they can sort of predict when ovulation occurs. If they know after ovulation their body temperature rises, they can predict where sort of in their cycle they're usually ovulating if they're trying to get pregnant. The ovaries also produce inhibin A and B, and they inhibit FSH production. And then activin enhances FSH production, but I'm not really going to be talking about that really in the cycle because it's not really one of the main hormones that plays a large role in the cycle. So AMH is produced by the ovarian follicle in the beginning of the follicular phase. And what it really does is it decreases the follicle sensitivity to FSH, and it prevents additional follicles from being recruited. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that we already recruit a few primordial follicles, and that one primary follicle is chosen to go out through the rest of the cycle. And we don't want to over-recruit those follicles. We do want the 2 to 4 million follicles that are present at birth to last as long as possible throughout the years of that a woman is fertile. So we don't want to over-stimulate or produce follicles. So AMH helps prevent that from happening, and that does that at the beginning of the follicular cycle. And then we have androgens, and androgens are one of those compounds that I mentioned that is very similar to estrogen, and it's released from the thecal cells in the follicular phase, and it diffuses to the granulosa cells, which are the cells that are releasing the estrogen, and aromatase converts the androgens to estrogen. So we have 3 phases in the cycle, and the first phase is known as the follicular phase. And menstruation begins the first day of menses. And the rationale behind that is it's really the easiest way to track a cycle, is if you can track when the menses begin, and then you can really track exactly how long a cycle is, and if it's proceeding along a normal cyclic pattern, or if there's a dysfunction within the cycle. So at the start of the cycle, estrogen and proestrogene are very low, and these levels being really low are what stimulate FSH to rise. And when FSH rises, it stimulates the follicle to grow. Now initially LH is low because its primary job is really not in the follicular phase. It does stimulate some release of estrogen, but remember FSH is really the primary hormone in the follicular phase. So the follicle begins, once it's stimulated, it begins to release estrogen. Low levels of estrogen actually have a negative feedback on the gonadotropin releasing hormone, LH, and FSH. So those levels drop. Estrogen has a positive feedback on itself, and it stimulates the release of more estrogen from the granulosa cells. As the follicular phase progresses, the follicle begins to secrete progesterone and inhibin. And this inhibin becomes really important when it comes to what is known as the LH surge, because we want LH to be the primary hormone as we go into ovulation for the start of ovulation and the development of corpus luteum. And with inhibin being present, it's going to reduce the amount of FSH that is released from the anterior pituitary. So you have a rise in estrogen and progesterone, and that tells your pituitary to start again producing FSH and releasing LH. At the same time, estrogen peaks about 1 day before ovulation. Estrogen was having that initial negative feedback on gonadotropin releasing hormone, but as estrogen levels rise and reach close to their peak, it actually starts to have a positive feedback on the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And together with the progesterone and estrogen re-stimulating the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, and a re-release of the gonadotropin hormone, and with the presence of inhibin, you get what is known as an LH surge, which is a really high level of LH. Now you do get a increase in FSH as well, but not near the levels of the LH. And the LH surge is what actually marks the end of the follicular phase and the beginning of ovulation. So ovulation is you now have basically a mature follicle, and it secretes prostaglandins and protolactic enzymes, and these enzymes dissolve connective tissue holding the follicle together. And this occurs about 16 to 36 hours after the LH surge. The follicle will rupture, and the ovum or the egg will be released from the follicle and travel to the fallopian tubes, where the corpus luteum develops. And the corpus luteum has a key role to play in the development of hormones that also play a part in the feedback loops. So the corpus luteum produces progesterone, estrogen, and inhibin. Progesterone, and this is considered the luteal phase, named after the corpus luteum. Progesterone is the primary hormone of the luteal phase, but estrogen increases here as well. But you need more progesterone because it's responsible for really priming that uterine lining and recruiting blood vessels to that uterine lining and thickening the uterine lining in case fertilization occurs and a zygote does need to implant into the lining. It is getting it ready for that. So the progesterone, the estrogen, and the inhibin from the corpus luteum have a negative feedback effect on LH, FSH, and gonadotropin-releasing hormone. So these are very low during this phase, almost non-existent. So the corpus luteum only has a shelf life of about 12 days, and it spontaneously apoptoses if not fertilized. If fertilized, different hormones occur. But with non-fertilization and its disintegration, you basically get a reduction of estrogen and progesterone. And that reduction in those hormones stimulate both gonadotropin-releasing hormone and FSH hormone to begin to rise. And then that is what starts the cycle all over again. It should be noted that that drop in estrogen and progesterone is what causes the uterine lining to shed. Those hormones were recruiting blood vessels to the lining and thickening of the lining. When they drop, those blood vessels basically go away and the uterine lining sheds, which is what starts menses. So this is a chart from another class that I took, and I just really love this chart because it really shows where the hormones are and during what phase. So if you'll start with estrogen, it starts here, and estrogen and progesterone are really low at the start of the cycle. And then you'll see as FSH comes in here, and then there's some LH coming in right around here. This is when estrogen or estradiol in this form begins to rise. So it starts to rise here, and then it'll reach its peak. And then remember that progesterone also starts to rise. And that rise in progesterone with this rise in the rise in the peak of estrogen and the rise in progesterone are what stimulate the anterior to pituitary to begin to re-release FSH, because you'll notice FSH right here has dropped. So as these rise and start to reach a peak, you get that surge of FSH here, but here's your real LH surge. That LH surge, the inhibin has kept the FSH low. The gonadotropin with the high levels, releasing hormone with the high levels of the estrogen has been released, and that allows this LH surge to occur, which really starts the ovulation. And then as that occurs, you'll notice the drop in LH, and then you'll also notice that FSH begins to drop back down as well. As they're dropping down, the corpus luteum is here beginning to main hormone, produce progesterone, and also produce estrogen, getting the body ready for fertilization if it should occur. Around here, the corpus luteum disintegrates, and those levels drop back off, and then we start back here with low levels of progesterone and estradiol, and the LSH and the FSH coming in and beginning to play a role in restarting the cycle again. I just want to thank you for listening to me talk about the feedback loops of female hormones, and here are my references. Thank you and have a good day.